Napoleon Bonaparte ruled France from 1799 to 1815 and is one of the most influential leaders in recent history, even outside of France. What's up guys, Friendly Neighborhood Pig here, and in this video we'll be going over almost every aspect of Napoleon's life and reign. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos in the future, and don't forget to check out some of the other videos on my channel as well. Also, before we start, there will be a lot of French words in this video I may mispronounce, so I just wanted to say that before anyone comments. Also, may even mispronounce some non-French words. Anyways, let's just get into the video. Before we talk about Napoleon, it's important to understand a little of what was going on in France at the time, particularly the French Revolution. Now this is a complicated subject that can easily be its own video, but here will just be a brief overview of some of the most important events. The French Revolution lasted for a period of 10 years, from 1879 until 1799. During this time, major political and social changes happened in France that would continue to have an effect not only on France, but much of Europe for decades. At this time, France was a monarchy, ruled by King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and was born in Austria, becoming Queen of France due to her arranged marriage to Louis Auguste, who would later become Louis XVI. Their popularity declined throughout their reign. Food shortages were among the many causes that led to the revolution. A variety of different factors, such as a substantial population increase and bad harvests, led to food prices increasing and dietary staples like bread becoming scarce. In response to hearing how the people couldn't afford bread, Marie Antoinette was rumored to have said, "Let them eat cake," though the French version of the quote is "Qu'il monde de la brioche," and refers to brioche, which isn't cake. The intention of the quote is to demonstrate how out of touch she was with the people, as brioche or cake was more of a luxury item most couldn't afford. However, there is practically no evidence that she actually said this. The quote wasn't even attributed to her until decades after her death, and was found to have been first used in a book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau from 1767, when Marie Antoinette was still a child. By 1789, France was also experiencing financial difficulties, partly caused by its involvement in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. In order to get more money, the French government would have to raise taxes and borrow. Due to the way the taxation system was, much of the wealthy and nobility did not have to pay any taxes, while the commoners were not exempt. Following the advice of his financial advisors like Charles Alexandre de Calonne, the king called the Assembly of Notables, which met in 1787. Tax reforms were proposed, but since many of them involved the upper classes paying taxes, the reforms were rejected. In order to address the many problems that were now accumulating in France, Louis XVI called the Estates General to meet for May 1789. The Estates General was a meeting of the 3 estates that made up society and had not been called since 1614. The first estate was members of the clergy, the second estate represented the nobles, and the third estate was for the common people. Since it had been 175 years since the last Estates General, there was some debate over how it should work and what the voting process should be. Despite being the majority, the third estate was not properly represented and was able to be outvoted by the first 2 estates. As the Estates General was underway and failing to come to any conclusions, the third estate met separately and declared itself the National Assembly on June 17, 1789. People from other estates were also invited to join. On June 20th, the National Assembly found that they were locked out of the place they usually met. Instead, that day they met on a nearby tennis court, where they agreed they would not disband until they had succeeded in accomplishing their goals of establishing a constitution in what is now known as the Tennis Court Oath. Members of the clergy and even some nobility began to join the assembly, and by June 27th, the king, seeing there wasn't much else he could do, ordered the rest of the first and second estates to join. On July 9th, the National Assembly rebranded itself as the National Constituent Assembly. Troops were also beginning to be called into Paris. On July 11th, Louis XVI dismissed one of his financial ministers, Jacques Necker. Necker had been popular among most of the people, and his dismissal was one of the contributing factors to the storming of the Bastille, which happened on July 14th. The Bastille was a medieval fortress located in Paris, and by 1789 it was used to hold weapons, and 7 prisoners were also kept there. Many regard the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789 as the beginning of the French Revolution. More notable events happened in the following months. On August 4th, the National Constituent Assembly started to abolish the feudal system and got rid of the privileges the nobles and clergy had. On August 26th, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was published. This outlined the rights of the people and made it so all would now be equal under the law, with Article 1 and 2 of it reading, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights," and "The goal of any political association is the conservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are life, property, safety, and resistance against oppression." The Declaration eventually served as the preamble to France's first written constitution, which was adopted on September 3, 1791. Under this constitution, France kept its monarchy, but it was now a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy. It was accepted by the king later that month. Earlier that year, in June 1791, Louis and Marie Antoinette attempted to escape France but were stopped and arrested in the small town of Rennes-en-Argonne and brought back. They are most likely looking to seek refuge in other European monarchies. This failed escape further damaged the royal family's popularity and the king's credibility as a leader. At this point, other monarchs in Europe were starting to worry about the revolution in France and its implications if its ideas spread throughout the continent. Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, who is the brother of Marie Antoinette, and Prussian King Frederick William II issued a statement in support of the French king, known as the Declaration of Pillnitz, on August 27, 1791. The statement was worded in a way that was intentionally vague about their intentions and did not commit them to any military action unless other major European countries did, something that was unlikely to happen. Regardless, the French saw it as an act of aggression and a threat to the revolution. It was one of the reasons why France declared war on Austria on April 20th, 1792. As Prussia was an ally of Austria, it joined the war a few months later. This was the beginning of the War of the First Coalition and the start of the French Revolutionary Wars. On April 25th, the first execution by guillotine occurred in Paris. The new government formed in 1791 wouldn't last much longer. The August 10th raid on Tuileries Palace effectively ended the king's reign and paved the way for France to become a republic on September 21st, 1792, around a year after the first constitution was adopted. The monarchy was completely abolished, and Louis and Marie Antoinette were arrested, imprisoned, and eventually put on trial and convicted of various crimes. The former king was executed by guillotine on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16th of that year. During this time, the execution of the king escalated the War of the First Coalition and led France to declare war against Great Britain and the Netherlands on February 1st, 1793, and later on Spain in March. On April 6, a Committee of Public Safety was established to protect the new republic from enemies both foreign and domestic. In June, a new constitution was adopted. This next part of the revolution became known as the Reign of Terror, led mostly by the Committee of Public Safety under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre. During this time, hundreds of thousands of people who were suspected to be a threat to the revolution were imprisoned and many were executed. While it's hard to determine exactly how many people died, it is estimated that about 16,000 were sentenced to death, while around 10,000 died in prison. There were also thousands more that were killed in massacres throughout France. This lasted from September 1793 to July 1794, when Robespierre himself was executed. Afterwards, many began to move away from the more radical policies of the Reign of Terror. The following year, in August 1795, a new constitution was adopted which established the Directory, a new form of government where its executive branch was led by 5 directors, and the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500 served as the upper and lower houses of the legislature. In October 1795, French royalists attempted an insurrection against the new government. The around 25,000 royalists were stopped by an army of about 6,000 French soldiers, under command of a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte. This event helped Bonaparte begin to make a name for himself, and not long after, he was given command of the French army in Italy. The War of the First Coalition lasted until 1797 and ended with a French victory, allowing the new French Republic to survive. The War of the Second Coalition began in 1798 and lasted until 1802, ending also with the French victory. In the meantime, the Directory lasted up until 1799. In October of that year, Napoleon Bonaparte returned from the military campaigns in Egypt. He was welcomed back as a hero and had become a popular figure in France. Future General Marcelin Morbeau recalls of his return. The houses were all illuminated and beflagged. Fireworks were being let off. Our carriage could hardly make its way through the crowd. People were dancing in open spaces, and the air rang with cries of, "Hurrah for Bonaparte, he will save the country." While the Directory was not as popular and was widely seen as inefficient, as France was now facing many new problems, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a man who was active in the revolution since its beginning and had recently become one of the 5 directors in May 1799, was looking to change the government and overthrow the Directory. He conspired with others to stage a coup. Some of these involved included another director, Roger Ducos, and Lucien Bonaparte, president of the Council of 500 and younger brother of Napoleon. Sieyès looked for a popular military figure to join the plot. When Napoleon returned from Egypt, Sieyès approached him, offering him a chance to join, which he accepted. The coup was carried out on November 9th, 1799, and began early that morning. Lucien Bonaparte persuaded the councils to relocate to the nearby suburb of St. Cloud, telling them that they were in danger of a coup and that it was going to be carried out by the Jacobins, a political club active throughout the Revolution and involved in the Reign of Terror. Napoleon was put in charge of their safety and given command of local troops. Meanwhile, in accordance with the plan, Sieyès and Ducos resigned from their positions as directors, and another director, Paul Barras, was pressured to resign as well. The remaining 2 directors still refused to give up their positions. They were arrested and eventually made to. The next day, Napoleon, along with some of his troops, were sent to St. Cloud, where the councils were meeting. He first entered where the Council of Ancients were and proceeded to give a speech. Though it was well received by his soldiers there, it did not go over as well with the members of the council. Napoleon then went to the Council of 500, which was nearby. They responded with even more hostility than the Ancients, shouting at and even assaulting him. Napoleon was able to escape, where afterwards the council voted to declare him an outlaw, after which Lucien Bonaparte left the room and went to a group of nearby soldiers that were in charge of guarding the councils, telling them a group of Jacobins were threatening the members of the Council of 500 and his brother's life, and ordered them to break up the meeting. When at first the soldiers hesitated, Lucien reportedly held a knife to Napoleon's chest and proclaimed that he would kill his own brother if he was attempting anything against the freedom of France. This apparently worked, and the soldiers went in and broke up the meeting, effectively dissolving the councils and the Directory. Later that night, the Constitution of 1795 was repealed. Sieyès, Ducos, and Napoleon were appointed as the provisional councils, and a new constitution was adopted in December. This was the beginning of the consulate, a form of government where executive power was to be shared between the 3 consuls, though Napoleon was able to seize power from the other 2 by using his popularity and the new constitution to establish himself as first consul, a position that held considerably more power than the other 2. To many, this marked the end of the French Revolution and was the start of the Napoleonic era, which we will go over now throughout the video. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769 in Ajaccio, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, which had recently become a part of France. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, married Maria Letizia Remolino in 1764, and together they had 13 children, 5 of which died at birth or in infancy. Of the 8 children that survived, Napoleon was the second born. While the family was not wealthy, his father was able to prove that they descended from minor Tuscan nobility, which allowed his children to attend school in France. In 1779, at the age of 9, Napoleon, along with his older brother Joseph, began attending school in France, staying in Autun for a few months to learn French, then to military school in Brienne. As most of the students there came from wealthy French backgrounds, Napoleon did not fit in well and was often bullied for being Corsican and having an accent, and for his poor French. He mostly kept to himself, occupying himself with books. It is said his first battle took place there as he led some of his fellow students in a snowball fight in winter of 1784. Later that year, Napoleon left Brienne to go to military academy in Paris. In February 1785, his father, Carlo Bonaparte, died, leaving his family in a poor financial situation. Later in September, Napoleon graduated from the academy, ranking 42nd out of the 58 students who passed. he was made second lieutenant in the Lafayette Regiment of the Royal Artillery, where he served until the early days of the French Revolution. He spent much of this time on leave, frequently visiting Corsica, and in 1792 was elected as the lieutenant colonel of the Corsican National Guard. During the revolution, Corsica was divided mainly amongst those who supported the revolution, royalists, and those who wanted Corsican independence. While for much of his life Napoleon was a Corsican nationalist, he increasingly began to side with the revolutionaries. In February 1792, Antoine Christophe Salicetti, who represented the National Convention on Corsica and had supported Napoleon's election to lieutenant colonel, ordered the suppression of monasteries and convents. Catholic Corsicans opposed this, and on Easter Sunday, riots broke out in Ajaccio. This resulted in 4 days of fighting between the National Guardsmen led by Napoleon and the citizens of Ajaccio, and resulted in multiple deaths, including one of Napoleon's lieutenants. During this, Bonaparte had also unsuccessfully tried to gain control of the town's citadel. In response to this incident, some of his rivals wrote to the War Ministry, blaming Napoleon for the violence and essentially accusing him of treason. Napoleon defended himself, writing his version of events, which read in part, "In this terrible crisis in which we found ourselves, energy and audacity were called for. A man was needed who, if he were asked after his mission, would swear to having transgressed no law and would be in the position to reply, like Cicero or Mirabeau, 'I swear that I have saved the Republic.' He was called to go to Paris to defend himself. When he arrived in Paris, the city was still in the midst of the revolution. This was also around the time France had declared war on Austria and Prussia, and due to these more pressing matters, no one cared much about what happened in Corsica, or the fact that he had overstayed his leave of absence that had expired in January and was technically a deserter. In July 1792, he was promoted to captain. Napoleon stayed in Paris for the next few months and was able to witness many notable events of the revolution, such as the demonstrations on June 20th, where demonstrators raided the Tuileries Palace, and again on August 10th, which resulted in the end of the monarchy. Not long after France became a republic, Napoleon returned to Corsica once again, where he came into more conflict with Corsican nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. Paoli had gone into exile in England after the French conquest of Corsica in 1768 and returned at the start of the revolution. Both Napoleon's parents had fought alongside Paoli, but did not go into exile with him and accepted French rule. While Napoleon idolized Paoli for much of his early life, Paoli considered the Bonapartes to be traitors, and as the French Revolution went on, the two continued to grow apart. In early 1793, Napoleon participated in his first major military operation, participating in the French expedition to Sardinia. He served as the second in command to Paoli's nephew. The expedition was a failure, and many blamed Paoli for purposely sabotaging it and setting them up to fail. Napoleon said that the expedition was absolutely denuded of all which was necessary for a campaign. They marched without tents, without uniforms, without cloaks, and with no artillery train. This event helped reinforce his support for the French Revolution and solidified his breakaway from Paoli. In May 1793, Napoleon was arrested by Paoli supporters but was soon able to escape. A few weeks later, the Bonapartes' family house in Ajaccio was vandalized, and the family was forced to leave Corsica, which they did later that summer. Napoleon would only return to his homeland once more for a short time in 1799 on his way back from Egypt. Paoli requested help from Britain, and Corsica became under British control from 1794 to 1796. Throughout the summer of 1793, there were a series of revolts and insurrections throughout various French cities. This culminated in French royalists in Toulon willingly handing over the city to British, Spanish, and Neapolitan forces in August. Toulon was an important naval city located in the south of France. Losing it would have been a huge loss for the Republic, so they set out almost immediately after to recapture the city. Napoleon was given command of the artillery, partly because there weren't many others available due to many leaving France or being executed, and partly because of his connections with prominent figures like Antoine Christophe Salicetti and Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre. The siege went on to last until December, and Bonaparte himself was injured in battle, but his planning and actions were largely responsible for the French Republic's victory. On December 22, 1793, at 24 years old, he was appointed Brigadier General. In the following months, he was put in command of the artillery of the French army of Italy, and shortly after submitted a plan to invade Italy to the Committee of Public Safety. With the end of the Reign of Terror in summer 1794, Napoleon, who had recently returned from a diplomatic trip to Genoa, was arrested for his connection to the Robespierre brothers, but was released after 2 weeks. Had he been in Paris during that time, it is likely he would have been guillotined. In early 1795, Napoleon participated in an expedition to take back Corsica from Paoli and the British, but they were repelled by the British Navy and failed. Afterwards, Napoleon was left virtually unemployed, now living in Paris. He had turned down an offer to serve in the War of the Vendée, a series of uprisings by French royalists. During this time, he was also engaged to Desirée Clary, whose older sister was married to his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The two communicated through letters throughout the summer of 1795, when Desirée Clary lived with her mother in Genoa. Though this relationship would not work out and the two never married, Napoleon became romantically involved with Josephine de Beauharnais later that year. During this time, he authored a romantic novella titled Clisson et Eugène, a story about a soldier who falls in love with the woman. The story was most likely inspired by his own romance with Desirée Clary. In late summer, Napoleon found work at the topographical department of the Committee of Public Safety. He was still in Paris in October 1795 when he was put in charge of suppressing a royalist uprising on October 5th. As mentioned in the first part of the video, his success here led him to be given command of the French army in Italy, where he was to fight Austria and its Italian allies. On March 9, 1796, Napoleon married Josephine and 2 days later left to go to Italy. On March 27th, he arrived in Nice to take command of his army. There, many of Bonaparte's subordinate officers were more experienced and older, and at first did not have much respect for him. One of them, André Massena, later recalled, "At first, they did not think much of him. His small size and puny face did not put him in their favor. The portrait of his wife that he held in his hand and showed to everyone, his extreme youth, made them think that this posting was the work of another intrigue. But a moment after, he donned his general cap and seemed to grow by 2 feet. He questioned us on the position of our divisions, their equipment, and the spirit and active number of each corps, gave us the direction that we had to follow, announced that the next day he would inspect all the corps, and that the day after they would march on the enemy and to give battle. When Bonaparte arrived, his army was demoralized, malnourished, and underpaid. He addressed this, saying to them, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. The government owes you much and can give you nothing. The patience and courage you have shown in the midst of these rocks are admirable, but they gain you no renown. No glory results to you from your endurance." He then promised that he would lead them to the most fertile plains of the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Napoleon achieved his first victory as command of an army on April 12th at the Battle of Montagnat. In the following days, more French victories in Melissimo, Dago, and Mondovi enabled the French army to be within reach of the Sardinian Piedmont capital of Turin, leading to an armistice signed between the Sardinian king, Victor Amadeus III, and Napoleon Bonaparte on April 28th, only a short time after the campaign began. Eventually, a full peace agreement was signed in May that officially marked the end of the Kingdom of Sardinia's involvement in the War of the First Coalition, and leaving Napoleon's army to be able to focus solely on Austria. The treaty also allowed the French army to be able to pass through the Sardinia-Piedmont territory to get to the rest of Italy. One Sardinian officer reportedly said of the French, "They sent a young madman who attacks right, left, and from the rear. It's an intolerable way of making war." Meanwhile, Bonaparte addressed his troops. "Soldiers, you have in 15 days, you have won 6 victories, taken 21 stand of colors, 55 pieces of cannon, and several fortresses, and overrun the richest part of Piedmont. You have made 15,000 prisoners, and killed or wounded upwards of 10,000 men. Hitherto you have been fighting for barren rocks, made memorable by your valor, though useless to your country. But your exploits now equal those of the armies of Holland and the Rhine." The war continued against the Austrians. One notable event was the Battle of Lodi, which occurred on May 10, 1796, where the French army crossed a bridge under heavy siege by the Austrians on the other side. While the French were victorious here, the battle had little military significance, but was an important part of Napoleon's career. Here, his bravery and willingness to put himself in danger alongside his men earned him their admiration and respect, and afterwards Bonaparte began to think of himself as more than just a general. The battle also became important and well known throughout France. A few days later, the French army entered Milan. Throughout the Italian campaign, Napoleon signed armistices with others in Italy, like the Duke of Parma, the Duke of Modena, and even with the Papal States. Artwork was also taken and sent to France. By spring 1797, after a series of victories, the French were within reach of Vienna, leading to an armistice signed on April 18th. A further peace treaty was signed in October, marking the end of the First Coalition, though France was still at war with Great Britain. Bonaparte returned to France in December 1797. Following his return, there was talk of a potential invasion of Britain. However, due to Britain's naval superiority, this never took place. Instead, it was suggested that France should establish itself in Egypt, which would disrupt British trade routes. Egypt at the time was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon arrived there near Alexandria in summer 1798. Around 167 scientists and other researchers accompanied him and his thousands of men on the expedition. Upon arriving, the army began marching towards Cairo. Shortly before they arrived in the city, the Battle of the Pyramids occurred on July 21st and was a French victory. However, much of the French fleet was destroyed by the British at the Battle of the Nile in August. The defeat here was a big loss, as they were now cut off from France with the destruction of their ships. On August 22nd, Napoleon founded the Institute of Egypt to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment to Egypt. It also focused on studying a variety of subjects such as science, arts, math, and history. In an attempt to gain favor of the local population, Napoleon wanted to give the impression that he was interested in converting to Islam. However, this had limited success. The Ottoman Empire declared war against the French in September 1798, and in October, the people of Cairo revolted against the French. Napoleon responded to the uprisings with violent force, even firing on one of the most important mosques in the city, the Al-Azhar, when the rebels were inside of it. In the end, 300 French and around 3,000 Egyptians died. In response to the growing threat from the Ottomans, Napoleon began a preemptive invasion of Syria in February 1799. Following a victory at El Arash, the French army laid siege to the city of Jaffa in March, which lasted for 3 days. At one point, Bonaparte sent a messenger to demand the city surrender. The governor of Jaffa responded by decapitating the messengers and displaying their heads on the city walls. This angered the French, and the next day they entered the city, massacring civilians and destroying whatever they could. One onlooker recalled of it, "The sounds of shots, shrieks of women and fathers, piles of bodies, a daughter being raped on the cadaver of her mother, the smell of blood, the groans of the wounded, the shouts of the victors, quarreling about loot." Around 3,000 prisoners were taken, some of whom were soldiers that had previously fought at Al Arash. They were taken to a nearby beach and executed. Napoleon's justification for this was that they did not have enough food or the means to take care of all of them. After Jaffa, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague throughout the French army. Napoleon visited those who were sick, doing what he could to take care of them and trying to boost morale. One medical officer who was with them remembered, "The general walked through the hospital and its annex, spoke to almost all the soldiers who were conscious enough to hear him, and for 1 hour and a half, with the greatest calm, busied himself with the details of administration. While in a very small and crowded ward, he helped to lift, or rather to carry, the hideous corpse of a soldier whose torn uniform was soiled by the spontaneous bursting of an enormous abscessed bubo." Bonaparte himself never contracted the plague. Those who were able to left Jaffa on March 14th. From March 20th to May 20th, Bonaparte's army attempted unsuccessfully to take the city of Acre. After this defeat, the French began to retreat back to Cairo. Along the way, they stopped in Jaffa, where Napoleon ordered the remaining plague victims to be poisoned. As Napoleon saw it, this would end their current suffering and prevent future suffering if they ended up being captured by the enemy. The French arrived back in Cairo on June 14th. Napoleon had his last victory in Egypt on July 25th at the Battle of Abu Qur, when British General Sidney Smith transported Ottoman soldiers to Egypt to try and end French rule there. It was during this time when Napoleon was made aware of the political situation in France through newspapers he was able to obtain. Around August 22nd or August 23rd, he left Egypt and began his journey back to France. To many of the men in Bonaparte's army, this was seen as an act of betrayal. Though the Egyptian campaign was largely a failure, Napoleon arrived back in France in October and was welcomed back as a hero. A month later, he took part in the successful coup, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate, bringing an end to 10 years of the French Revolution as mentioned in the first part of the video. Bonaparte, Sieyès, and Ducos were provisional consuls until December. When the consulate became official, Sieyès and Ducos were replaced with Jean-Jacques Régier de Commissaire and Charles-François Lebrun as second and third consuls. As first consul, Napoleon held the vast majority of power. France at this time was still engaged in the War of the Second Coalition. Bonaparte had tried to make peace, writing to the leaders of England and Austria in December 1799, but his proposals for an armistice were rejected. In May 1800, Napoleon left Paris and led his army through the St. Bernard Pass over the Alps. It was the quickest, but also the most dangerous route he could have taken. Afterwards, Napoleon's army entered Milan and narrowly defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. Bonaparte returned to Paris that summer, but the war still continued. General Jean Marais led the French to victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Hohenlinden on December 3, 1800, leading to the Treaty of Luneville, ending Austria's involvement in the War of the Second Coalition in early 1801. In March 1802, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Amiens, which marked the first time in a long time when most of Europe was relatively at peace, though it wouldn't last long. In 1802, an election was held which asked the people, "Shall Napoleon Bonaparte be consul for life?" The decision was overwhelmingly approved and a new constitution was adopted that year, which enabled Napoleon to serve as first consul for the remainder of his life. Throughout his reign as first consul, he brought about a number of reforms to French society. For instance, in July 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, ending the hostilities between France and the Catholic Church, which had been going on throughout the Revolution. While this did not make Catholicism the official state religion as it was before the Revolution, it did recognize it as the majority religion of France, as most French were Catholic. Napoleon, who was not religious himself, did promote religious freedom and equality for other religions, such as for Protestants and even Jews who had been oppressed in much of Europe at the time. Bonaparte also focused on France's overseas colonies. In 1802, he restored slavery to the French colonies, which had been outlawed in 1794. However, following a series of French losses, which eventually led to the independence of Haiti in 1804, Napoleon gave up on having a French empire overseas and chose to focus on Europe instead. In 1803, he authorized the sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States, nearly doubling the country's size. In March 1804, the Napoleonic Code went into effect. This standardized the law throughout all of France, whereas before, different parts of the country followed different systems of law. As French writer Voltaire said of France, "Is it not an absurd and terrible thing that which is true in one village is false in another? What kind of barbarism is it that citizens must live under different laws? When you travel in this kingdom, you change legal systems as often as you change horses." Napoleon understood that if he wanted to unify France, one of the things he'd have to do was establish a legal system that applied throughout the nation. The code granted equal rights to all, but was in most cases unfair to women. For instance, a man could not be divorced for committing adultery unless he brought his mistress into the home, and a woman could not only be divorced for adultery but also face prison time. Women's civil and political rights were also limited. It also gave fathers almost complete control over their families. Sons would not be allowed to marry without their father's permission until they were 26, and daughters until they were 21. Parents would also be allowed to imprison their children for disciplinary reasons. While some of these were unique to the Napoleonic Code, these attitudes were mostly commonplace at the time. The code also got rid of feudal and royal privileges acquired at birth and allowed men to choose their occupation. Napoleon would go on to call this civil code his greatest accomplishment, and in many ways he was correct. The code influenced not only France and Europe, but other countries around the world as well. Napoleon also improved France's education by creating a system of secondary schools regulated by the state. He replaced the central schools of the old regime with lycées, which were schools designed to educate the next generation of French leaders. These schools taught a variety of subjects and implemented strict discipline. Scholarships were provided to them. Bonaparte expressed his view on education in a meeting in 1807, saying, "Of all our institutions, public education is the most important. Everything depends on it, the present and the future. It is essential that the morals and political ideas of the generation which is now growing up should be no longer dependent upon the news of the day or the circumstances of the moment. Above all, we must secure unity. We must be able to cast a whole generation in the same mold." Napoleon also created the Bank of France in 1800, and in 1803 established the Germinal franc as currency. Named after the month Germinal from the revolutionary calendar, these coins also bore Napoleon's image, first as first consul and later as emperor. He also sought to improve infrastructure in Paris and throughout the country, instituted the metric system in 1801, and the Louvre Museum that had opened 10 years earlier was renamed to Musée Napoléon in 1803. Newspapers, books, and plays were also censored to a degree. At the start of his reign, there were over 70 newspapers in Paris, but by 1811 only 4 remained. The following letter to his Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, from 1805, reveals his intentions on controlling certain types of media. "I would like newspaper editors to have enough sense not to publish news harmful to the nation. The attention of the papers ought to be directed toward attacking England, English fashions, English customs, English literature, the English Constitution. Voltaire did us great harm by his constant essays in Anglomania. It seems to me that the success of the tragedy, The Templars, is turning attention to that incident in French history. That is good, but I don't think we ought to allow plays on subjects of too recent a date. I see in one of the papers that there is talk of putting on a tragedy about Henry IV. That period is not distant enough to rouse no passions. The stage needs a touch of antiquity, and I think that, without interfering with the theater too much, you ought to veto this particular play, but don't make your intervention public." While Napoleon was fairly popular, there were still those who opposed his rule. Bonaparte survived multiple assassination attempts. One of them occurred on Christmas Eve 1800, when conspirators attempted to blow up the first consul while he was on his way to the opera using a device with gunpowder. The explosion missed Napoleon, but killed and injured innocent bystanders. There was also a failed British-backed attempt at restoring the French monarchy that was discovered and stopped before it could happen in 1804. Napoleon used this and other attempts at his life to point out that if he had been killed, there would have been nothing to stop the monarchy from returning to France, and the people would lose all the progress they made during the revolution. He argued the best way to prevent this from happening would be to have a hereditary system that would let him have a chosen successor. This was used as justification for a referendum to be held about whether Napoleon should go from first consul to emperor. The results were almost unanimously in favor, and Napoleon was crowned Emperor of the French on December 2nd, 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, in a ceremony that was attended by the Pope. He crowned his wife, Josephine, Empress. Since he had no children at this time, Napoleon named his older brother Joseph to be his heir. This marked the beginning of the First French Empire. Napoleon knew how to use paintings and artwork as a propaganda tool to create his image. His enemies, particularly those in England, did this as well. Lots of British cartoons featured a character of Napoleon that has become well known. This is also where the idea that he was very short comes from. In reality, though he wasn't very tall, he was also not comically short. It is estimated that he was around 5'6" to 5'7", which was average for the time. He was also commonly referred to as Bony or Little Bony. There were also stories and nursery rhymes written about him that scared children into thinking Napoleon would eat them. The peace created by the Treaty of Amiens ended May 1803 when Britain declared war on France after a number of issues were unable to be solved diplomatically. Almost immediately after the outbreak of war, Napoleon began planning an invasion of the United Kingdom, which never ended up happening. In the following months, a series of actions by Napoleon and France worsened their international reputation and led to other countries allying with Britain against France. One example being the kidnapping and execution of Louis Antoine, the Duke of Ingham, and a member of the French royal family. His death was ordered by Napoleon under the suspicion of him being involved with the previously mentioned assassination plot. Britain's Prime Minister, William Pitt, also spent time lobbying for other countries to join his side. By 1805, Austria, Russia, Sicily, Naples, and Sweden had joined Britain in forming the Third Coalition. France was joined by its allies Spain, Württemberg, Bavaria, and more of its client states. Beginning in March 1805, French-Spanish ships fought against Britain's naval forces. The British, under the leadership of Horatio Nelson, had a significant victory with the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21st, and by November, the French and Spanish forces were defeated, confirming Britain's naval superiority. France was still dominant in continental Europe, however. In October, Napoleon led the French in a major victory against the Austrians at the Battle of Ulm. Austria had invaded Bavaria the previous month without waiting for the Russians, who had yet to join them at the front. In November, the French captured the Austrian capital of Vienna. Austria's Emperor Francis I, who was also Holy Roman Emperor under the name Francis II, fled the city. Russian forces eventually did join with the Austrians, leaving Napoleon in a difficult position, as he was deep into enemy territory, outnumbered against a now united enemy, and also facing the possibility of Prussia joining the coalition. He knew that France needed a decisive victory here to finish the war. He decided to set a trap for the Austrian and Russian armies, luring them to attack on a battlefield he chose. The chosen location was near the town of Austerlitz in the modern-day Czech Republic, which at the time was part of the Austrian Empire. Near the area were the Pratzen Heights, an advantageous position to hold. In regards to the heights, Napoleon was quoted as saying, "If I wished to stop the enemy from passing, it is here that I should post myself, but I should only have an ordinary battle." He wasn't looking for an ordinary battle. Instead of occupying the heights, he willingly withdrew his troops off the heights. This, along with sending one of his generals to an allied camp to request an armistice, gave the coalition the false impression that the French army was weak and Napoleon was looking to avoid conflict. One of Tsar Alexander I's aides, Prince Peter Dolgorukov, met with Bonaparte to negotiate on November 27th and went back reporting that Napoleon was scared and anxious. The Austrian and Russian armies were now emboldened and eager to attack, just as Napoleon had wanted. On the morning of December 2nd, 1805, 1 year after he had been crowned emperor, the Battle of Austerlitz had begun. As the fighting began, coalition troops occupied the heights. Napoleon had intentionally left the right side of his formation weak to lure the Allies to attack there. This plan worked. At the start of the battle, Austrian and Russian troops attacked France's right flank. Fighting commenced near the villages of Telnis and Sokolnis. These villages would change between French and Allied control many times throughout the battle. When the battle started early in the morning, there was a heavy fog that covered the view of the ground. By 9 a.m., when the French had begun a counterattack to claim the Pratzen Heights, the fog cleared and the Austrian and Prussian armies could now see parts of the French army that had previously been hidden, which included French soldiers charging up the heights coming towards them. After over an hour of fighting, the French had control of the high ground. With this, the coalition army was now split in two, as the heights were their center. However, fighting continued in the northern and southern ends. Though France was winning, the battle was still not over. The Russian Imperial Guard was sent in a counterattack that caused the French 4th Line Regiment to retreat, though they were reported to still have shouted "Vive l'Empereur" as they ran past Napoleon. Napoleon responded by sending in his own Imperial Guard. After a violent struggle, the French guards ultimately prevailed. After fighting in the northern part of the battlefield came to an end with the French victory, all that was left to do was focus on the southern part where fighting continued near Sokolness and Telnis. French troops descended upon this area, sending the coalition armies in retreat. As they fled across frozen lakes, Napoleon ordered his men to fire at the ice, causing many to drown. The Battle of Austerlitz is regarded as one of Napoleon's greatest victories and helped put an end to the War of the Third Coalition. An armistice was signed with Austria later that December. In the early months of 1806, French armies, led by André Massena, invaded Naples, resulting in another victory for France. Napoleon appointed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Naples on March 30th, 1806. The War of the Third Coalition had largely been a disaster for many of the coalition members, especially for Austria. Following the end of the war, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine, which was composed of German states allied with and protected by France. This also led to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for around 1,000 years. Its leader, Francis II, maintained his role as Francis I, Emperor of Austria. Almost immediately after the end of the War of the Third Coalition, a new coalition, comprising of some of the same countries from the previous war, came together once again to try to defeat Napoleonic France and its allies. In addition to the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Russia, who had been consistently at war with France, the Fourth Coalition was joined by Prussia, along with their ally Saxony. The war against Prussia and Saxony started on October 9, 1806, with the French victory at the Battle of Schlietz, located in modern-day Germany. Prussian-Saxon armies suffered another defeat on October 10th against a French army commanded by Jean Lannes at the Battle of Saalfeld. It was here that Prussian Prince Louis Ferdinand was killed in battle. On October 14th, Napoleon led his troops to victory at Jena, while Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout did the same at Auerstedt. By October 25th, the French occupied Berlin. It was there in November that Napoleon inaugurated the Continental System. Designed to hurt Britain's economy, under this system, France and its allies were prohibited from doing trade with the United Kingdom. An effort was made to enforce this throughout continental Europe. Saxony ended its war with France in December with the Treaty of Posen and joined the Confederation of the Rhine. Following the important victory at Jena and Auerstedt, the French pursued the defeated Prussian army and won more battles in places like Erfurt, Prenzlau, and Hamelin. On November 6, at the Battle of Lübeck, France defeated Prussian and Swedish forces. On December 9, 1806, Napoleon arrived in Warsaw, where he received a warm welcome from the locals there, who hoped he would help restore Polish independence. On December 23rd, French, Prussian, and Russian armies fought at the Polish town of Żarnowo. Napoleon's army prevailed. The French continued east and defeated the Prussian and Russians again on December 26 at the battles of Golymin and Pultusk. Following these battles, both armies suspended their campaigns and started their winter quarters. Napoleon returned to Warsaw. The conditions that winter were particularly harsh, especially for the many French soldiers who had been away from home and at war for an extended period of time. As both armies hoped to wait out the winter, the French were beginning to run dangerously low on supplies, leading Marshal Michel Ney to go against his orders and move his army further north, where they discovered Russian General Levin August von Bennigsen was planning a secret attack. Napoleon was made aware of this, and the army was soon ordered out of their winter quarters. Napoleon left Warsaw on January 30th, 1807. In the meantime, the two armies fought in a number of engagements, eventually leading to one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars at Eylau. After 2 days of fighting there was no clear winner. Michel Ney described the battle, saying, "What a massacre, and without any result." The Battle of Eylau significantly worsened the French soldiers' morale and had a negative impact on Napoleon's army's reputation, who were beginning to no longer be seen as completely invincible. As the war continued, Napoleon summoned recruits from Spain, Bavaria, Poland, Italy, Holland, and France to reinforce his army. It wouldn't be until summer when peace would finally be made. Following France's major victory on June 14, 1807 at the Battle of Friedland, the coalition armies decided it was time to sign an armistice. Russian Tsar Alexander I met with Napoleon later that month. The first thing he reportedly said to the French emperor when they met was, "I hate the English as much as you do." The two got along well, and a peace treaty between France and Russia was signed on July 7th. As dictated by the agreement, Russia was to join the continental system. Prussian King Frederick William III, who was also at the meetings, was not treated as well by Napoleon. As opposed to the relatively lenient treaty with Russia, the agreement signed between France and Prussia on July 9th was considerably more harsh. In addition to joining the continental system, Prussia was made to pay financially for the war, reduce the size of its army, and lost large amounts of territory. Some of Prussia's former land was made into the Kingdom of Westphalia, with Napoleon's younger brother, Jerome Bonaparte, installed as king. The Duchy of Warsaw, a French client state made from ethnically Polish former Prussian territory, was also created. This was effectively the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition, though the Swedish were defeated when Stralsund fell on August 24th. Napoleon arrived back in Paris on July 27, 1807. Following the end of the recent war, Napoleon was arguably at the height of his power and influence in Europe. Later in life, he would recall the treaties signed with Prussia and Russia at Tilsit, saying, "Perhaps I was happiest at Tilsit. I had just surmounted many vicissitudes, many anxieties, at Eylau for instance. I found myself victorious, dictating laws, having emperors and kings pay me court." Now that the war was over, he was able to return home and focus on internal affairs in France. Enforcing the continental system remained one of his main priorities. Portugal, one of Britain's oldest allies, maintained its relationship with the UK, especially through trade. Napoleon demanded Portugal end all trade with Britain, arrest all British subjects in the country, and declare war against Britain. When these demands were not met, France prepared to invade. On October 27th, a treaty was signed with Spain that outlined their intentions for Portugal, and the following month, the French army invaded Portugal. By the end of November, the French, led by Jean-Auguste Junot, occupied Lisbon. The Portuguese monarchy fled to the colony of Brazil. Though France and Spain had previously been allies, the relationship was now coming into question. To counter this, France invaded Spain in February 1808. By March, they had reached Madrid. By summer that year, Napoleon's brother, Joseph, was made King of Spain. Now all of the Iberian Peninsula was seemingly under French control. However, the local population there, especially in Spain, began to fight back against French rule. Uprisings occurred throughout the peninsula, leading to many French losses, and eventually the British getting involved. Following a defeat at the Battle of Vimeiro on August 21st, 1808, the French were forced to leave Portugal. At first, Napoleon showed little interest in the conflict that was rapidly developing there and expected an easy victory. However, he became more concerned as it appeared France was losing, even more so after France lost Portugal. Following his meeting with the Russian Tsar Alexander in Erfurt, where he also met with one of his idols, Goethe, Napoleon went to Spain to take command of the army. There he helped France win a number of battles, such as at Zornoza, Tudela, and Somosierra. By December 4th, Napoleon occupied Madrid. France was also beginning to have success against Britain in northern Spain. While defeating Britain was one of Napoleon's main goals, he had to leave Spain in January 1809 to prepare for another war that was starting to develop in Central Europe. He would never be able to return to Iberia, and the war there would last until 1814, ending with the French defeat. Austria had been defeated by Napoleon 3 times before, and was now looking to get revenge and get back the territory and influence it had lost. In this war, Austria was unable to count on some of their allies from the previous wars. Russia was in an alliance with France, and Prussia was unwilling to join this war following their defeat, though Austria was able to receive help from Britain and smaller allies. France was joined by its client states. As much of the French army was preoccupied with the ongoing war in Spain and Portugal, Austrian Emperor Francis I viewed this as a good opportunity to go to war. On April 10, 1809, Austria invaded Bavaria, beginning the War of the Fifth Coalition. This was earlier than the French anticipated, and Napoleon was still in Paris when this happened. He departed early in the morning on April 13th and arrived shortly after. As Napoleon took command, the French won a series of battles all in a relatively short period of time, including the Battle of Togenhausen on April 19th, Abensberg on April 20th, and Lancia on April 21st. All these led to a major French victory at Ekmol on April 22nd, where Napoleon defeated an army led by Archduke Charles, the brother of the Austrian Emperor. Following this, the Austrians hoped to retreat across the Danube River and sought to take shelter behind the medieval walls of Ratisbon. The French engaged with them there on April 23rd, where Napoleon was wounded in battle by a bullet that hit his ankle. The Austrians lost again here and retreated further across the Danube into Bohemia, leading the way to Vienna open. The city would surrender to Napoleon and his army on May 13th. Despite the French in control of Vienna, they still needed to deal with Archduke Charles's army, which was still on the other side of the Danube and had destroyed the bridges in the city. The French needed to build their own bridge in order to cross, which they did near the villages of Aspern and Essling. The ensuing battle occurred on May 21st and May 22nd and was Napoleon's first major defeat in years. The French, who were surprised by the strength of Austria's counterattack, retreated back into Vienna, and since Archduke Charles chose not to pursue them further, they were able to have enough time to regroup. Napoleon would spend the next 6 weeks reorganizing his army and learning from his mistakes, and made his second attempt at the Battle of Wagram on July 5th and July 6th. Wagram was one of the largest battles in European history at that time, and though the French won, both sides suffered heavy losses as tens of thousands on both sides were killed. The Austrians retreated, but the French eventually caught up with them at the town of Znaim, where Archduke Charles and Napoleon signed an armistice on July 12th. A further peace treaty was signed at the Schönbrunn Palace near Vienna on October 14, 1809, effectively ending the War of the Fifth Coalition. In addition to the battles here, there were other fronts in the war. The Austrians, led by Archduke John, invaded northern Italy, and Archduke Ferdinand led an invasion of the Duchy of Warsaw. There were also uprisings against French rule throughout Europe, such as in Tyrol and in parts of Italy. Also in the summer of 1809, French troops occupied the Papal States and arrested the Pope. Throughout Napoleon's reign, he and the Pope Pius VII were often in disagreement with one another. For instance, the Pope did not want to join France's war against Britain. He had also refused to recognize his brother Joseph Bonaparte as the King of Naples, or to annul his brother Jerome's marriage. Some papal lands were also annexed by France. The Pope publicly excommunicated Napoleon on June 10th. In July, he was taken to France, where he remained a prisoner there until 1814, although he was kept in comfortable conditions. Following the end of the Fifth Coalition, Napoleon began to seriously look for an heir. He knew in order to further legitimize his empire and ensure its longevity, he needed a son, something his wife, Josephine, was unable to provide him. After years of marriage, Josephine, who was approaching 50, had not provided the emperor with any children. On November 30th, 1809, Napoleon informed her of his intention to divorce. While they both remained close, this was something they knew needed to be done. In the following months, the marriage was annulled. Napoleon initially sought to marry Tsar Alexander I's younger sister, Anna Pavlova. However, as negotiations stalled, he lost interest, and instead married the Austrian Emperor's 18-year-old daughter, Marie-Louise. It was hoped the marriage between the two would positively impact France and Austria's political relationship and create an alliance between the two empires that had long been at war. The two married in March 1810, and about a year later, on March 20th, 1811, Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, or Napoleon II, was born and proclaimed the King of Rome. In the meantime, French relations with Russia were declining. Napoleon and the Russian Tsar had got along well at their previous meetings and maintained a friendly correspondence with each other. However, things began to change. Napoleon's marriage with the Austrian Marie-Louise was a contributing factor, and Russia was skeptical of Napoleon potentially being in support of an independent Polish state. Perhaps the biggest reason was that on December 31st, 1810, Russia withdrew from the continental system and resumed trade with Britain. Both sides were aware of the deteriorating relations and prepared their militaries for a potential war. France made an alliance with Prussia in February 1812, and a similar agreement was made with Austria in March. Both Austrian and Prussian armies would participate in France's upcoming invasion of Russia. In April, Russia demanded that France withdraw its armies in Prussia, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and other territories in the region. Napoleon refused, and at this point, war was inevitable. On June 24th, 1812, Napoleon led his army across the Neman River and into Russia. His army included soldiers of various different nationalities and was made up of around 600,000 men. Having beat the Russians in battle before, Napoleon likely assumed the war would be over relatively quickly. This would be different from his other campaigns, though. Throughout most of the Napoleonic Wars, the French strategy had been reliant on its army moving fast, living off the land and winning decisive victories that would persuade his enemies to ask for peace. When the French invaded Russia, the Russians did not engage with them directly in any major battles, and instead retreated further into Russia, destroying much of the land as they went. Napoleon and his army continued after them, but as most of the land was destroyed, it meant it was difficult for his army to live off it, and they consequently grew weaker the longer the invasion lasted. One of the few major engagements of the war occurred in September 1812 in the Battle of Borodino. Leading up to the battle, Napoleon proclaimed to his men, "Soldiers, this is the battle you have so much desired. The victory depends upon you. It is now necessary to us. It will give us abundance of good winter quarters and a prompt return to our country. Behave as at Austerlitz, at Friedland, at Vitebsk, at Smolensk, and let the latest posterity recount with pride your conduct on this day. Let them say of you, he was at the battle under the walls of Moscow." Though the French won, tens of thousands died, and it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. This was made worse for the French, as in addition to those they had already lost from starvation and disease, they could not as easily reinforce their army as they were now deep into Russian territory. In the days following the battle, on September 14th, the French occupied Moscow. By the time they arrived, much of the city's population had been evacuated and it was mostly empty. As the French occupied Moscow, Napoleon stayed in the Kremlin. During the early morning hours of September 16th, he awoke to a large fire engulfing most of the city and he was forced to evacuate the Kremlin. The fire lasted for days and the majority of Moscow was destroyed. In its aftermath, parts of the city were looted by both French and Russians. Napoleon was able to return to the Kremlin on September 18th. There has been some debate over who started the fires, and even today it is not entirely clear. Russia's scorched earth policies may have contributed to it, as well as soldiers from either sides unintentionally starting it. Both sides blamed each other. Napoleon was reported to have said as he watched the fire, "What a terrible sight, and they did this themselves. So many palaces. What an incredible solution. What kind of people? These are Scythians." Though the fire had further depleted Moscow's resources, Napoleon decided that they would stay there. He had hoped that with one of Russia's most important cities now under French control, Alexander I would request an armistice. He waited for about a month. On October 13th, the first snow fell. Napoleon realized peace talks were never going to happen, and that his army did not have the resources to survive winter, especially now after most of the city was damaged in the fire. French armies were also losing to the Russians in most of the military encounters they had there. On October 19th, Napoleon led his army out of Moscow and began his retreat back towards France. Upon leaving, he gave an order to destroy the Kremlin, though they ended up only partially damaging it. On October 24th, the Battle of Maloy-Yaroslavets, another major battle of the campaign, occurred and further convinced the French to continue retreating. As the French continued on, winter began to set in. The cold weather, combined with the lack of food and disease and guerrilla warfare from the Russians, resulted in heavy losses. Soldiers were unable to feed themselves and their horses and were forced to leave behind some weapons and artillery. In the end, around over 400,000 of them died in the campaign. Napoleon arrived back in Paris on December 18th. While the French suffered heavy losses, the Russian casualties were also high. However, following France's failed invasion of Russia, the rest of Europe saw a new opportunity to finally defeat Napoleon. In the early months of 1813, a new coalition against France began forming. Austria and Prussia, who had supported France in the invasion of Russia, now ended their alliances and began preparing their armies for war. Prussia was the first to act, though Austria, whose leader Emperor Francis was now Napoleon's brother-in-law due to his recent marriage, declared war on France later in the year in August. Russia was also eager to go to war against France, and Britain, which had been consistently at war with France, also joined the coalition. These countries were joined by their other allies as well, and France was also joined by some of theirs. In the recent months leading up to the war, Napoleon sought to rebuild his army and recover from his recent defeat. In January 1813, he signed a new concordat with the Pope, who was still a prisoner at Fontainebleau. He also had to cut spending due to the significant amount of money that was spent on the wars. The first major battle of the War of the Six Coalition was on May 2, 1813 against Prussian and Russian armies near the German town of Lutzen. Though the French defeated the coalition here, there were heavy losses on both sides. A similar situation occurred on May 20th and 21st at the Battle of Bautzen. Neither were the decisive victories Napoleon was looking for and were costly enough for both sides to sign a temporary armistice on June 4th. Napoleon would later regret this, as the coalition was able to benefit from it much more than the French did. The coalition would create a plan to win, known as the Trachenberg Plan. Their strategy was to avoid battles directly with Napoleon and instead focus on defeating his other generals and marshals, gradually weakening his army. Fighting resumed in August. The Battle of Dresden was Napoleon's next major battle, occurring on August 26th and 27th. Here, the outnumbered French were able to defeat the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian forces. However, this did little to end the war, as in the following weeks, French armies, mainly not commanded by Napoleon, suffered multiple defeats, leading to the Battle of Leipzig, which began on October 16th. This is also sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Nations, as it was one of the largest battles in Europe at the time and would be until World War I. Here the French were led by Napoleon. However, in addition to being somewhat weakened from the previous battles, they were also greatly outnumbered. Fighting lasted until October 19th, at which point the French had lost and were forced to retreat. The defeat here led to the end of the Confederation of the Rhine, as the coalition sought to reduce France back to its pre-revolution borders. Before this, Bavaria had withdrawn from the Confederation and declared war on France on October 14th. While the French retreated, Napoleon led them to victory at the Battle of Hanau against the Bavarians and Austrians. As Napoleon arrived back in Paris, he began a speech to the French Senate saying, "A year ago, all Europe marched with us. Today, all Europe marches against us." The coalition had offered peace in November 1813, known as the Frankfurt Proposals. Under the conditions described there, France would lose much of its territories, including parts in Poland, Italy, and the Netherlands, but Napoleon would be able to remain as emperor. After years of war and following two recent major defeats, much of France favored peace, but Napoleon did not accept. The coalition prepared to invade France, many looking to get rid of Napoleon permanently. In preparation for the incoming invasion, France looked to raise an army. They were only able to conscript a fraction of what they needed, and of those that came, many were young and inexperienced. By the middle of January, France had been invaded by Austria, Russia, and Prussia, along with their German allies. In February, Napoleon managed to lead France to victories in a series of battles known as the 6 Days Campaign. However, these weren't enough to stop the coalition from reaching Paris, which they did on March 30th. Upon hearing of the French defeat at Paris, Napoleon was at Fontainebleau. He had hoped to retake Paris, but his generals and high-ranking officials were opposed to this and would not follow his orders, many being in favor of him abdicating his throne. On April 2nd, the French Senate voted in favor of removing Napoleon from power. Now, seeing the reality of the situation, he realized there wasn't much else he could do. Napoleon had initially hoped his son would be able to succeed him, but the coalition would not allow it. On April 6, 1814, he renounced his throne, later issuing a statement saying, "The Allied powers have proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon was the sole obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe. The Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and for his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, even that of life, which he would not ready to make in the interest of France." In the proposed treaty, the coalition demanded Napoleon and his family no longer have any power, but they would be allowed to keep their titles. His wife, Marie-Louise, was given the Italian duchies of Parma, Guastalla, and Piacenza, and Bonaparte's family members were to receive monetary payments. The amount of money Josephine would receive each year was to be reduced, however, it was still a large amount. Napoleon was also to return his estates, funds he had withdrawn, and crown jewels to France, and was to be given sovereignty of the small Mediterranean island of Elba. On the night of April 12th, before signing the treaty, Napoleon attempted to take his life by drinking poison he kept with him, but over time it had lost its potency and only succeeded in making him sick for the rest of the night. The following day, he agreed to the coalition's terms. On April 20th, he said goodbye to the soldiers of his old guard at Fontainebleau Blue Palace, in a speech that many have recalled was emotional for the soldiers there. In it, Napoleon gave his reason for not continuing to fight, saying, "With men such as you, our cause could not be lost. But the war would have been interminable. It would have been civil war, and that would have entailed deeper misfortunes on France. I have sacrificed all my interest to those of the country. I go, but you, my friends, will continue to serve France. Her happiness was my only thought. It will still be the object of my wishes. Do not regret my fate. I have consented to survive. It is to serve your glory." He arrived at Elba on May 3rd. In France, the monarchy was restored to power. King Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI, who had been in exile, was installed as leader, since Louis XVII died in captivity in 1795 at the age of 10. Under Louis XVIII, France was a constitutional monarchy, and some of the changes made during the Revolution stayed. The king also signed a treaty in May 30th, which restored France to its 1792 borders and oversaw the removal of coalition troops in France. Still, the new monarch was not very popular in France, as many worried about him bringing the old regime back. It did not help that he proclaimed himself the direct successor to Louis XVI and XVII, and had Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's remains reburied and memorialized. Meanwhile, Napoleon was well received by the locals on Elba. On May 29th, Josephine died. Upon hearing this news, Napoleon went into mourning for 2 days. His current wife, Marie Louise, never visited him in exile, though he was visited by his mother and sister, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was also visited by his former mistress from Poland, Maria Łuska, and her son, who was widely believed to have been fathered by Napoleon. As the Emperor of Elba, Napoleon initiated a number of reforms on the island, including improving infrastructure and the education and legal system, and established a small military. He also had nice accommodations on the island. However, Napoleon's time there was short. He was not receiving the money he was supposed to get from the treaty signed at his surrender, and was paying close attention to what was happening in France and throughout Europe. There was also talk among some European powers of removing him from Elba and sending him somewhere else more isolated. These contributed to his decision to try and seize power again in France. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon left Elba while the coast was clear and set sail for France along with hundreds of his men. He arrived in southern France on March 1st and began to travel throughout the rest of the country. Today, you can drive the route he took, known as the Route Napoleon. It was inaugurated in 1932 and is marked with statues and monuments. Along the way, on March 7th, Napoleon encountered a regiment of soldiers. He approached them and reportedly said to them, "Soldiers, do you recognize me? If there is one amongst you who wishes to kill your emperor, here I am." The soldiers put down their weapons and enthusiastically joined him. News of Napoleon's return reached Paris within a few days. Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's former marshals that was now loyal to the king, told Louis XVIII, "I will seize Bonaparte, I promise you, and I will bring him to you in an iron cage." However, upon encountering his former emperor, Ney and his army of around 6,000 put down their weapons and joined him. As Napoleon traveled throughout France, he gained support among soldiers and civilians everywhere he went. More soldiers continued to join him and his army grew. Seeing that he did not have much support, King Louis XVIII fled the country late on March 19th. The following day, Napoleon and his growing army reached Paris. Bonaparte arrived at the Tuileries Palace and was once again emperor. Before this, on March 13th, European powers were meeting in Vienna and declared him an outlaw. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia later came together to once again defeat Napoleon. Napoleon knew another war was not going to be popular and initially tried to make peace. However, he eventually began to prepare his army for battle, though the military he had now was significantly weaker than it was before he had been exiled. Napoleon, who was now 46 years old and overweight, was also not as healthy as he used to be. He decided to attack first to prevent another invasion of France and moved the French army towards the coalition troops that were in present-day Belgium, at the time the Kingdom of the Netherlands. June 12th, Napoleon left Paris to join his army. On June 16th, 1815, he led the French to victory against the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny.
Hey, Friendlyneighborhoodpig, what's Ligma?
Ligma balls. The Prussians retreated and Napoleon's army joined with Michael Ney's, who had also fought a separate battle that same day. The army Ney fought was commanded by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who after the battle took a position near the village of Waterloo. The Prussians, defeated at Ligny, maintained contact with them and sought to join them there. The French, led by Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, pursued the retreating Prussians, while the rest of the army, led by Napoleon, took a position at Waterloo on the evening of June 17th. The battle started the next day, though Napoleon did not order the first attack until after 11 a.m. due to the ground still being wet from rain the night before, making it more difficult to move artillery and cavalry. The British-Dutch soldiers, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, managed to hold their ground against the French attacks, and in the afternoon were reinforced by the Prussians, who were still being pursued by Grouchy. Napoleon was warned of the possibility of the Prussians joining the battle that morning, but he did not change his strategy. Upon the arrival of the Prussians, they tried to alert Grouchy to bring his troops to Waterloo, but by then it was too late. Around 4 p.m., French cavalry attacked. The British cavalry had done so about an hour earlier. When he saw the French cavalry charge, Napoleon remarked that it was too early, but committed to supporting it. British troops responded by forming squares, which are made of groups of infantrymen coming close together in the shape that may resemble a square. These are usually used to repel cavalry attacks, and were successful in doing so at Waterloo. Throughout the battle, as more Prussians continued to join on the right side, more French soldiers would have to be diverted from the rest of the battle to confront them. By evening, Napoleon was forced to deploy his Imperial Guard, some of France's most elite soldiers. For a moment, it seemed as though this would work. However, they were soon repelled. The French had failed on almost all fronts, and the now disorganized army was eventually forced to retreat. Despite the battle lasting for less than 12 hours, it was one of the bloodiest. Around 30,000 French died, with only about 20,000 coalition soldiers dead. The Duke of Wellington would later say of Napoleon that his presence on the battlefield made the difference of 40,000 men. In the aftermath of the battle, Napoleon attempted to reorganize his army to continue fighting. He went back to Paris in order to gain support. When he arrived there on June 21st, he began to realize that he did not have much support. News of his defeat had reached France before he arrived, and the coalition armies were now preparing to invade. The upper and lower bodies of the legislature, the Chamber of Peers, and the Chamber of Representatives both were in favor of Napoleon abdicating as emperor. There was a brief consideration between Napoleon and his brother Lucien Bonaparte to dissolve the chambers and restore Napoleon to the dictatorial powers he had before he was sent to Elba. The next day, on the afternoon of June 22, 1815, Napoleon resigned his position as emperor for the second and final time, naming his son, who was 4 years old and in Austria, as his successor. He issued a statement to the French public, saying, "Frenchmen, in commencing the war for maintaining the national independence, I relied on the union of all efforts and of all desires, and the concurrence of all the national authorities. I had reason to hope for success, and I braved all the declarations of the powers allied against me. Circumstances appear to have been changed. I offer myself sacrifice to the hatred of the enemies of France. May they prove sincere in their declarations, and have really directed them solely against my power. My political life is terminated, and I proclaim my son, under the title of Napoleon II, Emperor of the French. The present ministers will form provisionally the council of the government. The interest which I take in my son induces me to invite the chamber to form the regency by a law without delay. Unite for all the public safety in order to remain an independent nation." The Napoleonic Wars officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed on November 20th, 1815. A provisional government was set up, with the 4-year-old Napoleon II as the recognized head of state until July 8th, when Louis XVIII returned to Paris. From this point, Louis XVIII would reign as King of France until his death in 1824, after he was succeeded by his brother Charles X. A few days after he abdicated, Napoleon left Paris and went to his residence at Malmaison, where he said goodbye to people and issued an address to the army. From there, he began to plan his escape from France. He hoped to be able to sail to the United States. In July, while attempting to leave France, he was forced to surrender himself to British ships that were blocking the ports. On July 15th, he boarded the HMS Bellerophon and was taken to England. Had he been captured by the Prussians or the French monarchy, it is likely he would have been executed. After staying in England for a little bit, the British informed him of their intentions to exile him once again, this time to St. Helena, an isolated island in the South Atlantic, making it nearly impossible for him to be able to escape back to Europe. This time, he would be under constant surveillance and would no longer be able to call himself emperor. On August 7th, Napoleon boarded the HMS Northumberland and began the long journey to St. Helena, where he arrived around October 16th, 1815. Around 20 people were allowed to join the former emperor in exile. For the first couple months on St. Helena, Napoleon stayed in a place called the Briars Pavilion, which was coincidentally the same place the Duke of Wellington stayed at during his visit to the island almost a decade earlier. The property was also occupied by the Balcombe family, whose teenage daughter, Lucia Elizabeth, or Betsy, spoke French and developed a friendship with Napoleon. Betsy Balcombe would later publish a book about her experience with Napoleon, in which she recalled what she had previously thought of him, saying, "The earliest idea I had of Napoleon was that of an huge ogre or giant, with one large flaming red eye in the middle of his forehead and long teeth protruding from his mouth, from which he tore to pieces and devoured naughty little girls, especially those who did not know their lessons." Though she was initially scared of him, the two got along well and spent time playing games and other activities together. He lived there until December 1815, when he moved into what was to be his permanent residence on the island, the Longwood House. Here Napoleon dictated his memoirs and a book about Julius Caesar, one of his heroes. He passed the time by horseback riding, playing cards, reading, and going for walks. He also tried to learn English during his time here as well. Throughout his exile, he waited for news of his son, which never came. In 1818, the Balcombe family left to return to England, possibly because the mother was sick or because Hudson Lowe, the governor of St. Helena, was suspicious of the family's relationship with Napoleon. Betsy Balcombe remembers Napoleon saying to her as they were saying goodbye, "Soon he will be sailing away towards England, leaving me to die on this miserable rock. Look at those dreadful mountains. They are my prison walls. You will soon hear that the Emperor Napoleon is dead." Over the years, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate, so that he was eventually confined almost entirely to his bed. Around this time, he reconciled with the Catholic Church, and the Pope allowed a priest to be sent to St. Helena, who heard Napoleon's last confession. On May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon died. His last words were reported to be, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine," though there are others who say he also said something about his son and retreating. In his will, Napoleon requested to be buried on the banks of the Seine River in Paris. Instead, he was buried in an unmarked grave on St. Helena. Napoleon's remains stayed there until 1840, when they were brought back to France. A state funeral was held in Paris, and his body remains there to this day. During his autopsy, the doctor cut off Napoleon's penis. It was taken off St. Helena by the priest and has changed ownership many times. It even went on display at a museum in New York City in 1927. A urologist, John Latimer, purchased it in 1977, and it has been with his family ever since. Very few people have seen it since, and it has never been photographed. While it is reported to be small, this is not necessarily an indication of its size in the emperor's life, as at this point it may be impossible to know for sure. Napoleon II spent the rest of his life in Austria. He went by France, the German version of his second name, Francois. Throughout much of his life, European monarchs were worried Bonaparte supporters would try and restore him to the throne of France. He sought to have a career in the Austrian army, though his life was cut short due to tuberculosis. He died on July 22, 1832, at age 21, without any children. Napoleon had a number of illegitimate children from various different mistresses he had throughout his life, one of which was Charles Léon Denisle, who reportedly grew up to significantly resemble his father. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of Napoleon's brother Louis, was born in 1808 and went on to be elected the first president of France in 1848. In 1852, he staged a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, thus recognizing the short and disputed reign of Napoleon II and starting the Second French Empire. From the Napoleonic Code to the many victories and battles across Europe, Napoleon left behind a legacy that has survived centuries after his death. For some, he is a hero who helped revolutionize Europe, and to others, he is a tyrant responsible for the deaths of millions of people. It is estimated up to 7 million people may have died in the Napoleonic Wars that lasted over a decade. While he may be controversial today, recently French President Emmanuel Macron commemorated the 200th anniversary of his death in May 2021. In a speech, he highlighted some of the positive and negative aspects of Napoleon's legacy, saying, "Napoleon could be both the soul of the world and the demon of Europe." In the speech, he also said, "The life of Napoleon is firstly an ode to political will. To those who believe destinies are frozen, lives are written in advance, the journey of the child from Ajaccio who became the master of Europe clearly demonstrated that one man can change the course of history." Well, looks like that's the end of this video. Hopefully you guys learned something. Thanks for watching if you made it this far. Hopefully the audio's improving as I'm trying to make it be. Anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to check out some other videos on my channel as well. This has been the Friendly Neighborhood Pig, and I'll see you guys in another video soon.